Yes, good morning. It's Wednesday, the 5th of August 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name's Pete Fairbairn, and my job is to help guide you through five of the biggest stories making waves in the world of sport. This morning, as always, I'm joined by one of Australia's top journalists and media personalities, Natalie Yoannidis, down in Melbourne. How are you, Natalie?
Oh, Pete, you know what? We're locked down here in Melbourne, so things are a little bit tough at the moment, but it's always nice to speak to you from sunny Queensland.
Well, it's always nice to know you've got no excuse not to get up bright and early and read the newspapers with me and find out the big stories. Also this morning, great to see Ireland knock England off in the one-day international. And as we currently speak, we're into the final 10 minutes or so of the English Championship playoff final. Fulham have just taken the lead against Brentford for a spot in the English Premier League next year, and we might even have a full-time result by the end of this show. But we're going to kick things off, and we are going to stay with the World Game. But from an Australian perspective, an article this morning via the News Corp Australia Newswire and Joe Barton, looking at the fact that the Central Coast Mariners have been put up for sale. Mike Charlesworth, the owner of the Mariners, announcing his intention to step away from a team who really have been that competition strugglers for a number of years. They are the A-League's smallest club, and there's no guarantee that the Mariners' licence would stay on the Central Coast. The Mariners CEO, Sean Millicamp, insists that with a booming junior system and strong ties to the community, it's imperative football retains a strong presence on the coast. However, he also admits that a Godfather offer, and he does rubbish $4 million rumours being enough to buy that club, but he says a Godfather offer could leave the club with no choice but to consider a move away. Nat, I want to ask, does the Central Coast deserve to retain an A-League team? And if they were to go, where would you look at basing the Mariners?
It's certainly going to be an interesting debate over the next couple of weeks, isn't it, Pete? Of course, it would be a huge blow for that region, for the Central Coast region and for Gosford as well, if the Mariners were to leave that area. Where would they go? That's a huge question. Of course, Sydney have already got two teams. They're going to be introducing another team very shortly as well with A-League expansion. And then, of course, Newcastle have already got their own side. I would like to see them stay there. I think that there is a very passionate supporter base that do get behind the Mariners, which we saw when they were a successful club a little bit earlier on in the competition. The competition, A-League competition as a whole, unfortunately, is struggling at the moment, and that is reflecting in these smaller clubs. I'd like to see them stay there, but whether or not money talks, as we know, and whether or not they are going to be able to maintain that relationship, that strong tie with a smaller population as well, is yet to be seen.
Yeah, I've been to a couple of games down there in Gosford, and there is always a good supporter base and a good atmosphere. Obviously the A-League and the FFA couldn't have predicted COVID was to come, but you can't help but wonder in hindsight whether expansion with the inclusion of Western United this year, Macarthur FC to come in next year, was a case of too much, too soon for a competition that's struggling to maintain its status quo, let alone expand beyond that. That being said, places like Canberra, Tasmania, we know there's an NBL team coming in Tasmania, and this could be, again, another opportunity for them. Cities without a team as it currently stands to try and put their hand up to take one on in the A-League. Our second story this morning comes from Mark Robinson in the Herald Sun. He analyses last night's big win for Richmond against Brisbane. It's the longest consecutive winning streak in the AFL at the moment, that being Richmond's 15th consecutive win over the Lions going back to 2009. Obviously, we saw last year Brisbane suffer two late season defeats against Richmond, one in round 23 and one in the final series. Heading into last night, the stars were aligned for Brisbane to end that hoodoo, playing in their home state against a Richmond team that's in a hub and is missing quite a few first-choice players. Brisbane been in fantastic form. Lachie Neale probably the form player in the competition, but Richmond were all over them last night. And Mark Robinson suggesting this is more than a hoodoo and says that something must swirl in the heads of Brisbane players. It dents their confidence, meant that every time last night that a Brisbane player lined up for goal, the pressure to deliver grew with every missed moment. I want to talk more broadly about that mental fragility that Robinson's suggesting exists, not just against Richmond, but in general. Will that mental fragility prevent Brisbane from actually winning the premiership this year?
It's a really interesting point that was made by Mark Robinson and by yourself, of course. It was certainly brought up last night when we were watching the game at home Brisbane's hoodoo against Richmond is not something to be laughed at. It goes back to 2009, like you said, and Richmond haven't been a super dominant force that entire time. It's only been in the last 4 or 5 years that Richmond have really started to find their groove, since 2017. So it's not like Richmond have been a powerhouse of the competition throughout that entire period. It's certainly a concerning hoodoo, and I think that it probably did play a big role in last night's matches, in last night's result. Inaccuracy in front of goal absolutely destroyed Brisbane. They dominated big parts of that match and yet just weren't able to capitalise. And then all of a sudden, Richmond would go down the other end and score. And that's so demoralising for a side. And I think that that's certainly going to affect them mentally heading towards finals, particularly against Richmond. We saw a side of Brisbane last night that we probably haven't seen this season. I think that they've probably been one of the only teams, apart from a loss to Geelong, that have really maintained consistent form, along with Port Adelaide, of course, as well, who are on top of the ladder. So I think that this is going to be seriously concerning for Chris Fagan, but I actually think that it might be something that really brings the team together. Maybe this can be a turning point for the Lions, obviously, with finals just around the corner, of course.
Well, it's going to go one of two ways, and we will find out whether Brisbane deserve to be in that premiership conversation alongside the likes of Port Adelaide, Richmond, and probably West Coast being the other at this point in time. Our third story today, which we'll spend a little bit more time on, we're going to stay in the AFL. A really interesting article from Peter Lawler in The Australian. He's managed to get some quotes from both John Longmire, the Sydney Swans coach, and Geelong coach Chris Scott around keeping the AFL short and sweet beyond the 2020 season. We know the league cut 4 minutes from each quarter this season, reducing games from 120 minutes playing time to 100 in order to ease pressure on lists in a season where clubs are being asked to back up with shorter breaks, as well as living within hubs and away from some of their performance, the performance facilities that they're usually accustomed to. Most people have just considered it's a one-off, it's just for this season only, and that it does impacts the very fabric of the game, but such highly respected voices such as Longmire and Scott urging the league to consider sticking with it beyond the season comes as a bit of a surprise to me. Nat, I know you've got some strong feelings on this. Where do you think it should stand for 2021 onwards?
Yeah, it's certainly going to be an interesting debate. I think it's fair to say that most AFL fans really do not like the shorter quarters. We've seen a lot less goal kicking. We haven't seen as many possessions from certain players that we would have seen. Haven't seen players racking up the numbers that we've seen in the past, that's for sure. Personally, I like it. I don't see an issue with staying with shorter quarters. In fact, it's been something that I've been saying for quite a long time, having lived in Sydney and covering rugby league, even a little bit of football. You go back to AFL and all of a sudden the games seem to really drag out. They go for so long, and I don't think that people realise how longer these shorter quarters actually do go. A couple of weeks ago, Fox Footy had some issues with their countdown clock and it actually started counting up. And all of a sudden you realise that these quarters are still going for around 25, 26 minutes. And I don't think that that's something that perhaps the public realised. Yes, we haven't seen as many goals as we have seen in the past, but that is because, of course, this is the first time that AFL clubs have had to deal with this. This is the first time that they've had to play a different style of game to adapt to these shorter quarters. So in time, of course, that's going to evolve and that's going to change.
Well, I like it when the guest on the show goes against the trend of public opinion. I think, obviously we live in a generation now where you can have what you want on demand, whether that be Netflix, whether that be Uber Eats, whether that be KO and whatever sport you want. So I think as the next generation comes through, having a game that takes 3 hours is a pretty big commitment for an afternoon. It's a pretty big commitment whether you're attending in person or watching on the television. There's obviously broadcast implications around advertising dollars and length of broadcast and that sort of thing. But do you think, Nat, that the next generation coming through is the one we need to be thinking of, and that's how the AFL can stay ahead of the other codes and continue to build its supporter base and its audience by being, a little bit flexible in this space?
The AFL is a really interesting beast when it comes to building an audience because they basically do have a saturated market in southern states and then, of course, in Western Australia as well. They have been moving into those northern states, particularly, into New South Wales and to Queensland, as we have seen over the last couple of years, both States having 2 quite successful sides. Whether or not it's about building a supporter base is yet to be seen, though. I think that they've dabbled with the idea of having smaller games. Of course, we saw the AFLX come into the pre-season for the last couple of seasons. People absolutely hated that, so it's fair to say people absolutely hate change. But while sports do move to these shorter formats to interest young people, Big Bash, of course, is focused more on young children and, getting kids involved in cricket and interested in cricket. I think that it's certainly something that the AFL can look at.
Now, you can't say everyone hates AFLX. My mighty Melbourne Demons, that's the only premiership we've won since 1964. But anyway, I'll leave that one there for the time being. We move on to our next story from Georgina Robinson in the Sydney Morning Herald. Dave Rennie, the incoming Wallabies coach, remains in Sydney in isolation, completing his 14-day quarantine alongside his wife, Steph. The great thing about Dave Rennie being in isolation is he's watching lots of footy. He's talking to the media about what he's seen. He's also clearly having lots of conversations with players, because he's been spending time chatting with Georgina Robinson about James O'Connor and his ongoing maturation and growth. I think most people know the story pretty well about James. Earlier in his career, some disciplinary trouble off the field, a lot of conversation around the development of his brand from a commercial perspective, really coming to at the expense of his rugby. Essentially cast out from Australian rugby, off overseas to France and the UK. But he's come back as a new man, a new person. He's playing fantastic rugby for the Queensland Reds. As Rennie says, he's as fit as he's ever been, with his best ever Bronco result, despite being the age of 30. And I guess it looks to how important he's going to be this year for the Wallabies, particularly with a lot of experience moving overseas after the last Rugby World Cup. Firstly, to that point, how important is he going to be as a leader in that group? And then secondly, would you like to see James O'Connor playing 10 or 12 in a gold jersey this year, Nat?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. We've had a couple of false starts with James O'Connor over the years, haven't we? Of course, he did come back a few years, I think it was back in 2015, to try his luck at World Cup selection, and that didn't quite work out. He said that he had matured back then. Didn't seem to be the case. At the moment, though, it does look like James O'Connor is really starting to hit his straps. And I think he deserves an opportunity in the number 10, which Dave Rennie has said. There's no one that's seriously standing out in that main playmaking role at the moment. Of course, you've got Matt Tamua down at the Rebels, who would certainly be in the mix as well. But without the likes of course, Bernard Foley going overseas, Quade Cooper's also gone over as well, or isn't playing in the Super Rugby competition. So I think that this is a great opportunity to give James O'Connor a chance. It's going to be a huge stage, of course, coming up against the All Blacks in those 2 test matches in Sydney and Brisbane is always daunting, and it is really throwing someone into the cauldron, isn't it? But it's going to be a sink or swim situation, and I think that he's deserved his opportunity to have first crack at it.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and I think Tamua in that 12 jersey, O'Connor at 10 and Tamua at 12's got a nice feel to it, not only with ball in hand, but also defensively as well. 2 guys who put a huge amount of effort into that facet of the game and trying to make sure it's really, really challenging, particularly if we do face the All Blacks 4 times in the one season, really, really challenging for them to be able to break through and score. Our final story today comes from The Australian, from Will Swanton. It's a nice article looking ahead, and he always covers this topic well, Will Swanton, but he looks ahead to the Broncos-Rabbitohs clash coming up this week. Of course, former coaches of each side coming up against one another, both under pressure in their own ways. Anthony Seibold at the Broncos, they're having an appalling season. He knows his job's on the line. Wayne Bennett at the Rabbitohs, I think they've been really inconsistent this year. They've got a roster that really should see them in the top 5 or 6 teams in the competition. They're no lay-down misère to actually play finals this year, so it's certainly a must-win game for Wayne Bennett and the Rabbitohs as well. But one of the things the article looks at is Damien Cook, the incumbent New South Wales and Kangaroos hooker. He's known for being so quick, with ball in hand and taking the opposition on. And the new 6 again rule was, everyone kind of speculated it would favour him above any other hooker in the competition because he is so quick and does love to run the footy. But Will Swanton's run the numbers, and since Anthony Seibold left and Wayne Bennett came in at the Rabbitohs, Damien Cook's running the ball roughly 50% less. Cook's got some quotes in the article saying, he's been encouraged to release the likes of Latrell Mitchell, and when you've got playmakers like him in the team, why wouldn't you be trying to get the ball in their hands? But it's a really interesting look, and I suppose breaks down the way in which we view Damien Cook and put some raw numbers there to highlight that his style of play has changed dramatically over the last 18 months. With all of that in mind, and I know it's a long-winded intro, but with all of that in mind, do you think that Damien Cook's under pressure to retain his representative jerseys due to the way he's been instructed to play at the Rabbitohs?
Look, I'll tell you what, if I was Damien Cook, I know I'd prefer to be playing at the Rabbitohs than the Broncos right now, that's for sure. Yeah, he probably is under pressure, but you've got to keep in mind that the way he would be looking at it would be team first. Every player has to look at it from that perspective. And if that's the way that Wayne Bennett wants him to play, if that's the way that it's going to benefit the Rabbitohs this season, then he's just got to find another way to make himself stand out from the crowd. That's simply how what it comes down to. I think that he's still, a great opportunity, a great chance to retain those representative jerseys. As we know, once you're in there, you usually get first look at it, you usually get first crack, and as long as he hasn't done anything wrong, that will continue, but he just needs to find another way to make himself really stand out.
Yeah, we know that Brad Fittler values the culture of that Blues team extremely highly, and that Cook has a big role to play from that perspective. That being said, Api Coruscant at Penrith playing some unbelievable football. It's going to be really fascinating to see, especially with State of Origin, of course, taking place at the end of the season, and Coruscant and Penrith likely to be playing right through to the back end of finals, you would think. Nat, we're going to have to leave it there. It's been fantastic to catch up this morning. While we've been chatting, I can confirm that Fulham have been promoted to the English Premier League. They actually won that one 2-1 against Brentford in the end, so we've missed a couple of goals in the last 10 minutes to go back and have a look at. But the richest game in world football, they call it, Fulham doing the bounce. Promoted, relegated, promoted again to the Premier League, where they'll join Leeds United and West Brom. Great to catch up. Please stay safe down there in Melbourne, and look forward to catching up with you really soon.
Thanks, Pete.